This happened when I was growing up around 2004 or 2005 when I was about 13 years old. It took place in a rural area, a good ways outside the town of Uvalde, Texas. The town itself was really small back then, not much to look at. It's just one of those towns that isn't on the way to anywhere important. My father knew someone who owned a deer lease that was about 1,000 acres down outside of that area. They were complaining about a ton of hogs tearing up their land. Since it was open season on hogs in the south, my dad decided to surprise me that summer and take me down for a week to hunt. Not only did that help him network for his job, but it also gave us some quality father and son time. I remember the drive down from Dallas was torture. It was about 7 hours in my dad's hardtop Jeep Wrangler. That car was so uncomfortable, I hated it. All I could do was either stare out the window or try to beat Super Mario Land 2 on my Game Boy Pocket, something I never managed to do as a kid. The drive took most of the day, so we arrived in the early evening. The owner of the land had told my dad that no one had leased it that year, and the cabin on the property might be a little rough and dusty. I didn't mind. By that time, I had been in scouts for a couple of years and spent a lot of time in the woods or fishing with friends. Needless to say, I was comfortable roughing it. After unlocking the gate and driving to the cabin, we settled in. The cabin was pretty rough. There's dust and dirt everywhere, flies, and evidence that raccoons had gotten inside and made a mess. After cleaning up a bit and setting up our cots and sleeping bags, we decided to turn in for the night. But something felt strange. I couldn't get comfortable or fall asleep for any real length of time. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Eventually, I drifted off for what felt like maybe an hour. When we woke up, it was early, around 7 a.m. We decided to scout the land for tracks and signs of hogs and find a good place to set up a blind. Since it was summer and brutally hot in the afternoons, morning was the best time to be out. After walking for about an hour, we came to a lightly dense area of trees and, luckily, found some signs of hogs. There's typical torn-up ground where they'd been rooting. We followed the signs into the trees, and I was looking for more when my dad suddenly stopped me with his arm. I looked up and saw someone standing about 50 yards away, partially obscured by the trees. This was private land, so they definitely weren't supposed to be there. We had confirmation from the owner that no one was around, and the gate had been locked when we arrived. The person was wearing a bright red jacket. We slowly walked toward them, and my dad called out, "Hey, we're hunters. This is private land." The person didn't move at all. They were completely still. We were about 30 yards away and could see that the figure was turned away from us, with hands in their pockets. What struck me as odd was that the person was wearing a ski jacket and pants. It was the middle of summer in Texas, where it was about 98 degrees by then. My dad called out again, but there was no reaction. He told me to stay behind him and unsnapped the clip on his pistol holster. We only had that since the rifles were back at the cabin. We cautiously approached from the right side, and my dad told me to stay put about 20 yards away. I crouched down, watching as he circled around to the front of the figure, all the while talking to it, asking if they were okay. When he finally got around to the front, my dad suddenly stood up straight with a confused look on his face. I called out, "What's wrong?" And he replied, "It's a mannequin." I walked over to where he was, and as I got closer, one thing really stood out. The clothes on the mannequin were brand new. No dust, no sap, no bird droppings. There's nothing to suggest it had been outside for more than a day. At that moment, I looked at my dad and could see the worry on his face. Almost immediately, I felt that eerie sensation again, like we were being watched, and I could tell my dad felt it too. I wanted to cry. I was suddenly terrified. My dad whispered, "We're leaving right now." He grabbed my hand and drew his pistol, scanning the area the whole way back. I tried my best to hold back tears as we hurried back to the cabin. The walk felt like an eternity, but it couldn't have been more than 45 minutes. As soon as we got back, we packed up and left. We drove home that same day and didn't talk much on the way back. I remember that my dad called his friend, the landowner, right after we left. The owner was confused and said he'd check the property the following week when he was in the area. He also mentioned that he'd never had problems with people on the land before since the property was high-fenced. My dad isn't usually a paranoid person, but with me being young and the possibility of someone else being on the lease, he decided it was best to be cautious and leave. When we got home, we talked, and my dad admitted that he hadn't slept well the night before either. He'd had the same uneasy feeling, but didn't want to wake me up since he thought I was asleep. A week later, his friend called back to say he had checked the entire property and found no trace of anyone. There was no mannequin, no nothing. That story still gives me chills. I have no idea what was really going on, but the paranoid part of me thinks it might have been some kind of trap or something. I grew up in Ohio in the 70s, and my childhood friend Joe and I were outside every chance we got. Joe lived on a farm that bordered a large forest, and my parents would drop me off in the mornings, and we'd stay in the woods all weekend. We'd only come out for school. We loved pretending we were frontiersmen, building shelters, setting traps, practicing fire-making with sticks, the whole 9 yards. By the time we got to high school, we got the idea to pull a Stand By Me, based on the movie of the same name that had just come out. The plan was to walk the railroad tracks through the country, but instead of looking for a dead body, we'd explore cool bridges to fish from and camp off the tracks. Of course, we knew it was dangerous and likely trespassing, but we were kids. We had a blast. We found beautiful rivers, discovered secluded bridges, fished, and hid from trains. At night, we camped in the woods near the tracks, making small, hidden fires. Nothing bad ever happened. It was idyllic. We enjoyed it so much that we did it multiple times without any problems. After high school, Joe and I went our separate ways. We both left home but stayed in touch and always tried to coordinate visits when we could. One summer in the mid-90s, we both happened to be in town for about a week. We'd spend time with family during the day, and at night, we'd either grab drinks at a bar or sit around a fire at Joe's house, reminiscing about the old days. One night, we got to talking about our Stand By Me trips. Well, nostalgia mixed with beer is a powerful thing. We decided to take a day, walk the rails, camp out for a night, and walk home the next day. When the day came, we started early. My wife dropped us off at our old starting spot just outside our hometown. She thought we were crazy and made sure to mention it. As she drove away, Joe suggested we take a different route than usual. How about heading in the opposite direction just to mix things up? We knew the land well and had a map, so I shrugged and said, "Why not?" Off we went. The day was fine. It was fun, but a little bittersweet in that nostalgic way. We found a bridge, sat on the edge, smoked a joint, and kept moving. We didn't bring fishing gear, but we had canned food and supplies. Before night fell, we picked a spot to camp. It's a thickly forested area with trees lining the tracks, making it feel like a tunnel. We had small hammocks to sleep in, but before setting them up, we decided to scout the perimeter. This was something we used to do back in the day, to make sure we weren't accidentally camping in someone's backyard. We walked about 100 feet into the woods and up a small incline. From there, we figured if we didn't see anything, we were good. But when we reached the top, we saw an old building down the hill, about 100 yards into the woods. It was barely visible through the trees. We debated what to do. We assumed it was an old sugar shack or something since there didn't seem to be any roads leading to it. From where we stood, there were no signs of life, no movement, no lights, nothing. Curiosity got the better of us, and we decided to check it out. As we approached, we realized it wasn't a sugar shack. It was an old church. The building looked like it had been abandoned for years, its wooden planks almost black from moss and rot. A weathered cross still stood on top, and the windows were just open holes with no glass. There were no doors, only open doorways. Peering inside, we saw rows of pews and a raised platform for a preacher. We didn't go all the way in. Something about the place felt wrong. There were no footprints or paths around it, and no roads led there. It was just an abandoned church, seemingly forgotten. Feeling uneasy, we left and climbed back up the hill to our campsite. The hill between us and the church made us feel a bit better, but we were still on edge. We chalked it up to the natural creepiness of stumbling upon an old, decaying church in the woods. As night fell, we set up our hammocks and decided to call it a night, planning to head out first thing in the morning. As we lay there, chatting quietly, we started to hear something coming from the direction of the church. Our conversation went something like this. "Do you hear that?" "Yeah, what is that?" "It sounds like singing?" It really did sound like singing. We both slid out of our hammocks, crouching low to listen more closely. The singing continued, but it wasn't getting any louder. After a minute or two, we decided to sneak back up the hill and see if we could figure out where the sound was coming from. Moving quietly, just like we used to in the old days, we crept up the hill. The moon provided just enough light to navigate without stumbling into trees, so we didn't use our flashlights. When we reached the top, we saw a faint light in the distance. It was coming from the church, and the singing was clearly coming from inside. Joe and I exchanged nervous glances. The light looked like candlelight, flickering through the open windows. We tried to make out what was being sung, but it was in another language, something that sounded like church music but unfamiliar. We watched for a while, trying to see who was inside, but all we saw were occasional shadows. Then, the singing stopped, and a booming male voice began to chant. The voice was deep and commanding, and it sent a chill down my spine. It sounded like an old-school preacher, the kind you see in movies, but again, it was in a language we couldn't understand. The preacher would say something, and then a group of voices would respond in song. This went on for a while until they all broke into a long, sustained wail that got louder and louder. It was so unsettling that I had to cover my ears. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I was about to suggest we leave when Joe grabbed my shoulder and whispered, "They're coming out." We were far enough away that we couldn't see them clearly, but we saw a line of figures emerging from the church, holding hands in a single file. Some of them had flashlights, and they began walking in our direction, singing again. We bolted. Grabbing our stuff as quickly and quietly as we could, we ran for the tracks. Once we were back on the tracks, we ran down them in the direction we had come from. After a few minutes, we stopped to catch our breath and looked back. We saw lights coming down the hill, moving erratically as if the people holding them were running too. We kept moving, alternating between running and fast walking, until we reached a road. According to our map, a small town was about 15 minutes down the road. We made it there, found a 24-hour gas station, and called my wife to come pick us up. When we told our friends and family, most of them thought it was just kids messing around. But those voices didn't sound like any kids I've ever heard. I still don't know who or what those people were, but that night in the woods remains the creepiest experience of my life. This incident took place about 5 years ago on an overnight trip into the Superstition Mountains, which are about an hour's drive east of Phoenix. I'm not going to specify the exact trail because I've been doing this long enough to know what happens when you post stuff on the internet. Whether it's a good trail, abandoned mine, ghosts, or whatever it may be, people come flocking, often bringing trash and loud music. Anyway, this particular trail was an 8-mile loop through a canyon, a pretty simple in-and-out overnight trip. I had planned to go with my friend, but a last-minute cancel on his part left me on my own. With my bag packed and my car ready, I decided to go solo. Unfortunately, I didn't leave the house on time, and some trouble navigating rough forest roads meant I didn't arrive at the trailhead until around 5:45 p.m. For those who don't backpack, this is a big no-no. I had about a 4-mile hike to reach my planned camping spot, and it was getting dark fast. I figured if I moved quickly, I could cover 2 to 3 miles before I had to find a spot. This strategy left me hiking a very dark trail alone, with about 15 miles of dirt road between me and anyone else. Hiking in the dark is scary, especially in a remote area like this, and being on my own didn't help. Eventually, it got so dark that I could only see where my headlamp was pointing. I realized I needed to stop and set up camp. Using just my headlamp as my light source and trying to move fast, I ended up in a less than ideal spot. However, there were some burnt pieces of wood and the remains of a fire circle, so it looked like people had been there before, though not recently. My first priority was to get a fire going. I scanned the area around me, found some dry wood, and got the fire started. After that, I set up my tarp and cracked open a can of chili mac that I'd brought. I was looking forward to eating it. I started feeling good. My camp was set up and my food was on the fire. The uneasiness from the hike had mostly gone away, though it was still there, a side effect of camping alone in remote areas. To fully understand what happened next, I have to explain how my camp was set up. The site I picked was a small clearing surrounded by large pine trees, with the trail about 30 feet to my left. When you're in the woods with a fire going, the fire casts a circle of light around it, and everything beyond the edge of that circle is pitch black. I was sitting on the ground near my fire, eating dinner, when a small rock about the size of a marble was thrown into my camp. I stared at the rock in shock, positive I was the only person on this trail that night. I immediately turned my light towards the area where the rock had come from, but due to the density of the pines and brush, I could only see about 10 feet ahead. For the next 15 minutes, I sat in disbelief. After a while, I convinced myself that I must have kicked the rock or it had fallen from a tree. I went to sleep that night, not expecting the pure terror that was about to unfold. I woke up to the sound of rustling leaves, barely audible unless you were listening for it. At first, I thought I imagined it, but as the rustling grew fainter, I realized it was moving away from me. Groggily, I reached for the handheld flashlight I'd left next to me when I fell asleep, but the more I searched, the more frightened I became. It wasn't there. I stood up in my sleeping bag, ducked out from under my tarp, and looked around. That's when I saw it, my flashlight, lying on the ground in a pile of leaves about 15 feet away. This is one of the few moments in my life when I was truly terrified. The flashlight, which I had left right next to me, was now outside in the woods. I hurriedly slipped on my boots, clutching my knife in one hand while keeping my head on a swivel. I weighed my options: stay here and wait out the night or attempt the 3-mile hike back to the car in the dark. I figured that whatever or whoever was out there would have the upper hand if I was out on the trail without light, so I decided to stay put and wait until morning. Eventually, I heard it again, the sound of someone walking through the woods. It was faint and far off, like someone strolling leisurely without a care in the world. The footsteps would fade for a while, then return an hour or two later, as faint as ever. This went on for 3 or 4 hours. Then, the footsteps grew closer, about 7 feet away. By this point, my fire had nearly burned out, and I had no more wood. The footsteps stopped, and everything went completely silent. I sat there, still as a statue, clutching my knife and praying I wouldn't hear anything else. I stayed like that for 2 hours until the sun finally rose, casting enough light for me to see that I was alone. I packed my things quickly and speed-walked the 3 miles back down the trail. When I reached the empty dirt road where my car was parked, I nearly sprinted to it. I unlocked my Subaru, jumped in, and didn't stop driving until I was at least 20 miles away. I stopped at a gas station in Apache Junction to buy a Red Bull, but mostly just to see or talk to another person. As I exited the store, I noticed something written in the dust on the back window of my car. Sleep well. A lot of weird things have happened to me on my various adventures through Arizona, but this was by far the weirdest and scariest. I thought I'd share it. There is a seriously deranged person living in the Superstition Mountains. Do yourself a favor and stay as far away from those mountains as you can. Let me tell you about my dad's old farmhouse. We all called it the Spooky House, and honestly, it earned the name. My dad grew up on dairy farms with his parents, who worked for a man that owned several farms. They moved around a lot, managing different properties. This was in Australia, so you can imagine some of the remote, rugged landscapes they lived in. But none of those places were as strange as the Spooky House. Dad was in his late teens to early 20s when they lived there, and it didn't take long for the house to start making itself known to them. From the beginning, the place just felt wrong. You'd walk in and feel it, like a heaviness in the air. It wasn't something you could easily explain, just a constant underlying sense that something was off. The house was old, with creaky wooden floors and walls that seemed to hold onto sounds far longer than they should. Dad said the floors were full of little notches and gaps, and my Nan would place stoppers in them to keep the wind from whistling up through the cracks. But the strangest thing was that every morning, they would wake up to find the stoppers pushed up from underneath, as if something beneath the house was trying to get in. Nan tried to brush it off as some sort of animal or perhaps the house settling, but Dad wasn't convinced. And neither was Nan, especially when other odd things began happening. In the doorways, they had these huge, heavy hippie beads that hung down, thick and solid. It would take a gust of wind to move them, or so they thought. Yet countless times, Dad would get up early in the morning to find the beads swaying gently, as if someone had just passed through them. But when he checked, everyone was still asleep in their rooms. As time went on, the house's unsettling energy seemed to grow stronger. It was almost like the house itself didn't want them there, like it was waiting for something. The tension in the air would build for days. Then there would be strange noises, scratches, thuds, whispers, and then silence. One particularly cold night, things took a turn for the worse. Nan, who had been silently growing more and more uneasy about the house, decided to call a psychic. She figured if anyone could explain what was going on, it would be someone who could see beyond what the rest of them could. So she made the call, hoping for answers. But when the psychic finally arrived, she didn't even get out of her car. She stopped at the end of the long dirt driveway, staring at the house, and refused to come closer. Nan walked up to her car and asked why she wouldn't come in. The psychic, pale and visibly shaken, told her, "There's something in there, something that doesn't want me in that house. You need to leave. Move out." "But what's in there? What are we dealing with?" The psychic shook her head, her voice trembling. "I don't know what it is, but it's not something I can help you with." With that, she drove off, leaving Nan standing there with no answers, just more questions. The fact that even a psychic refused to enter made the house seem even more sinister. Not long after that, strange things, Dad never liked to call them creatures, started showing up. They stalked the house at night, and none of them ever saw them directly, but they could sense them. Nan would wake up in the morning to find the grass around the house trampled down, especially near the windows. Whatever was out there had been circling the house in the dead of night, watching them. Her peg basket on the clothesline was ripped apart more than once, its pieces scattered across the yard. Nan would get irritated, mumbling about how she had to keep buying new ones, but that irritation soon turned into fear. Things started scratching at the windows at night, long, slow scrapes against the glass, as if whatever it was wanted them to know it was there. Dad told me he was always too scared to look. He knew, deep down, that if he did, something would be staring right back at him. In the mornings, they'd check the windows and see the paint scratched off at roughly human height. Grass beneath the windows would be flattened. One night, when my grandfather was working a few paddocks over, my Nan came into Dad's room, visibly shaken. She whispered, "It's back. It's outside." They huddled in his bedroom, too afraid to make a sound. The heavy atmosphere in the house felt even thicker that night as they listened to the sound of something moving around outside. It circled the house, slow and deliberate, its footsteps crunching the gravel with every pass. They sat there in silence, hearts pounding, until the first rays of dawn broke through. And then there was the time Dad experienced it firsthand. He was walking across the paddocks, heading to help his father with the cows in the early hours of the morning. The air was bitterly cold, the grass covered in frost. As he walked, he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind him, crunching through the frozen grass. At first, he thought it was just his imagination, but when he stopped, the sound stopped too. He began walking again, and once more, he heard it, a steady crunch, crunch. Dad's pace quickened, and when he stopped a third time, the footsteps didn't. They were coming toward him. That was all it took for Dad to bolt. He ran across 2 paddocks, vaulted over fences without even thinking, and didn't stop until he reached his father's side. It wasn't always just his family who experienced strange things either. Whenever Dad's parents left for a few days, he would invite friends over for parties. They'd hang out, drink, and have the run of the place. But no matter how big the group, by the end of the night, everyone always ended up sleeping in the same room. as if they couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. One night, it was just Dad and his cousin, playing pool and drinking. It was around midnight, and they were both pretty drunk when, out of nowhere, a dark figure appeared at the edge of the room and said, "Go to bed." Being as drunk as they were, they didn't question it. They shrugged, "Why not?" and went to bed. The next morning, they woke up to find the pool game had been neatly packed away. Dad's cousin looked at him and asked, "Who was that guy standing over us while we slept?" The weirdness didn't stop there, though. They'd hear footsteps on the roof, like someone walking around up there. But when they checked, no one was ever there. Doors would slam shut by themselves, and strange, disembodied voices would call their names from dark corners of the house. Eventually, Dad and his parents had enough and decided to leave. Not long after they moved out, the house mysteriously caught fire and burned to the ground. To this day, Dad doesn't know what started the fire, but he was more than happy to see the place reduced to ashes. The house had been abandoned for 2 years before we bought it. From the outside, it didn't seem particularly unusual, just an old home that had seen better days. When we first went for the viewing, there was something strange about one of the bedrooms. The closet door was padlocked shut, secured with a barn door latch and a heavy lock. Curious, we asked the realtor about it, but she just shrugged, saying there was no key. She told us it couldn't be opened unless we bought the house. Well, we ended up buying it, and naturally, the first thing we wanted to do was open that door. There was something unsettling about a locked closet that no one could explain. So, the day we got the keys, priority number 1 was unlocking it. After a few minutes of wrestling with a pry bar, we managed to break through. What we found on the other side wasn't exactly what we expected, but it didn't make us feel any better. It was a child's play area. The walls were painted in bright, cheerful colors, and the ceiling was covered in glow-in-the-dark stick-on stars and planets. The floor was covered in checkered tiles, giving it an almost playful look, but there was something wrong. There were no lights, no air vents, no windows. The room felt sealed, like it wasn't meant to be opened or used. My little brother, who had tagged along, took one look at it and with a mischievous grin said, "Well, this must be where they kept the kids before they died." We all laughed it off. Fast forward a few months, and the house was well into renovation. We had torn down walls, painted rooms, and tried to make the place feel like a home. One thing that kept happening, though, was the light in the loft. We had installed a daylight sensing motion sensor light there because it was difficult to set up a proper switch. But for some reason, the light would turn on by itself at all hours of the day. No matter how we positioned the sensor, it would randomly trip, casting an eerie glow in the loft at the most unexpected moments. At first, it was annoying, but soon it became a running joke. Every time it happened, one of us would shout, "Will you darn kids quit running in the house?" And weirdly enough, after that, the light would stay off for the rest of the day. About a year into living there, the house had started to feel like our own, despite the occasional weirdness. The creepy closet room had been transformed into our computer room, and we used it regularly without much thought. My wife and I left for work at the same time each day, but she always came home a couple of hours before I did. One day, I got a call from her, and she sounded genuinely confused. "Why did you come back home earlier today?" she asked. I hadn't. I told her I'd been at work all day, but she insisted that when she walked into the house, the chair from the computer room was in the kitchen. Now, the chair wasn't lightweight or easy to move, and it would have had to travel through 2 doorways, down a hallway, and down a flight of stairs to reach the kitchen. I hadn't moved it, and she certainly hadn't either. The thought of it moving by itself was unsettling, but we joked about it, blaming the dead kids for pulling a prank on us. "Those heathen kids," we said, laughing nervously. 6 months later, the weirdness peaked. We went to bed one night with everything in its usual place, the house quiet and calm. But when we woke up, we found something bizarre waiting for us in the kitchen. All of our kitchen knives had been removed from the butcher block. In their place were butter knives. The sharp, dangerous knives had been carefully placed behind the sink, as if someone had thoughtfully swapped them out. My wife and I hadn't touched them, and there was no logical explanation for how or why it had happened. We were both spooked and decided to spend the entire day out of the house, trying to clear our minds. We told ourselves we were being ridiculous. Ghosts aren't real, and there definitely weren't any dead kids in the house. But then one day, I got talking to our neighbor, an older gentleman who had lived on the street for decades. Casually, I asked him if he knew anything about the previous owners. That's when he dropped a bombshell. No children had died in the house, but a grown man had. The room with the creepy closet, the one we had turned into our computer room, that's where the previous owner's brother had committed suicide. He had been going through a rough time after his wife left him, and he just couldn't handle it anymore. He cut his wrists in that room and bled out. The previous owner, his brother, continued to live in the house for a while after that. But when he was foreclosed on, he attempted to take his own life in the same room. Thankfully, his children found him in time and he survived. It all started to make sense in a chilling sort of way. The strange lights, the moving chair, the rearranged knives. Maybe it wasn't kids haunting the house after all. Maybe it was something darker, something tied to the tragedy that had unfolded in that room. Later that year, our family grew, and we had to rearrange the rooms to make space for the baby. The creepy closet room? It was emptied out and left as storage. And strangely enough, once we stopped using that room, all the odd happenings came to an end. The lights stopped flickering on their own. The furniture stayed in place, and the kitchen knives remained where they belonged. 9 years have passed since we moved in, and the house has been peaceful ever since. We still use that room for storage, but our son, who's now 4, plays in there occasionally. Despite the bright daylight that floods through the windows, he always insists on turning every light on before he plays. When I asked him why, he just shrugged and said, "It makes it less weird to play in there." When my husband and I rented an old house, we knew it would need a lot of work. It was one of those places that had clearly been neglected for years. The walls were covered in outdated, peeling wallpaper, and the ceiling had the dreaded popcorn texture. Worse yet, the basement had been vandalized by the teenagers who lived there before. Swastikas were crudely spray-painted on the walls, a sick reminder of the kind of energy this house had absorbed. Still, it was affordable and we needed a home, especially with our baby boy coming home soon after being born prematurely. He spent nearly 5 months in the NICU, and we wanted everything to be perfect for him. We spent weeks fixing up the house. We stripped the wallpaper, painted the walls, and removed the popcorn ceiling. Every day was a project, and we felt a sense of accomplishment as the house slowly transformed from a grim, haunted place into a livable space. But no matter how much we worked, something always felt off, like the house itself resented us for trying to change it. The basement was the worst. We didn't bother fixing it up. The vandalism, the swastikas, and the mess left by the previous occupants were too much to deal with. Besides, we didn't need the extra room, and there was no way I was spending more time down there than necessary. The one time I went down there was enough to convince me to stay out for good. The air was thick, suffocating even, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was down there with me, angry that I had invaded its space. That same unsettling feeling didn't stay confined to the basement. Sometimes it seemed to seep into the rest of the house, like a dark shadow creeping up the stairs. It would start with a feeling of being watched. I'd feel eyes on me, cold and heavy, and the room would seem to grow darker. At first, I convinced myself it was just my imagination, that my mind was playing tricks on me because of how creepy the basement was. But it kept happening, and eventually, I couldn't ignore it. Whenever the air felt too thick, too suffocating, I'd take the baby and sit in the car while my husband burned sage throughout the house, trying to clear the energy. He hated doing it. Every time he lit the sage, he said the air became almost unbearable, heavy with a rage that wasn't ours. He told me he'd see shadowy figures moving toward him, like they were trying to escape through the smoke. He'd feel them pushing against him, angry, trying to shove him out of the house. Even though the sage would help for a while, the darkness always seemed to creep back in after a week or two, like it had only retreated temporarily, gathering its strength for the next encounter. There were so many strange and unexplainable things that happened in that house. But two incidents stand out the most, burned into my memory like a bad dream I can't forget. One day, I was taking a shower while my son sat in his little bouncer seat in the bathroom doorway. He was always so peaceful, content to sit and watch me while I hurried through my routine. I had just finished rinsing off and pulled the shower curtain open when I heard a sound. A sharp, clattering noise behind me. In an instant, I saw the can of air freshener, which had been sitting securely on the back of the toilet, fly across the room, headed straight for my baby. My heart stopped. If the bathroom door hadn't been slightly ajar, the can would have hit him square in the head. I lost it. I started screaming at whatever was in the house. I didn't care if it heard me. "If you're going to mess with someone, mess with me," I yelled. "Leave my baby alone." As if on cue, the detachable shower head that had been hanging securely on its hook suddenly broke free. It whipped through the air with a speed that sent it crashing into the side of the tub, the end of its cord still attached, swinging dangerously close to my head. That shut me up real fast. My heart raced and I could barely breathe. Whatever was in the house wasn't just watching us. It was angry, and it didn't like me standing up to it. The second experience happened at night when my husband and I were in bed. Our son was fast asleep in his room down the hall. He was still on oxygen, and we had a pulse oximeter monitoring his levels. Because of that, we always kept a baby monitor nearby so we could hear if the alarm went off. It had become part of our nightly routine. We'd lay in bed, talk for a while, and then say our goodnights before drifting off to sleep. On this particular night, we had just finished talking and had said goodnight when, not even 5 minutes later, we both heard it. Clear as day, the sound of a little girl's laughter came through the baby monitor. It was soft, high-pitched, and chilling. My husband leapt out of bed, ready to confront whoever was in the house. But I knew, deep down, there was no one there. My body froze, couldn't move, couldn't speak. I was paralyzed by fear, unable to shake the sound of that laugh. It was so innocent yet so impossibly wrong. I stayed in bed, stunned, until sleep finally claimed me. I don't miss that house. I don't miss the creeping shadows, the heavy air, or the constant feeling of being watched. My mom was in the hospital 50 miles away, battling what we believed might be her final days. I was only 19 at the time. We weren't sure how much longer she had, and the weight of that reality was heavy on my mind. My dad stayed by her side at the hospital, leaving me alone in the house. Their home was large, too large for one person, especially someone like me who always felt uneasy being alone. It stood isolated from any neighboring houses, tucked away on a small lagoon, far off the main road. The darkness that surrounded the house at night always gave me chills. That night, I went to bed around 1 a.m. I was messing around on my laptop, playing games and trying to distract myself from the gloomy thoughts of my mom's condition. My room was located in a separate wing of the house. The entire wing could be sealed off with a single locking door, though I hadn't locked it. Despite my usual fears, I tried to keep calm by keeping all the lights on in my wing, every single one, from the hallway lights to the closet. The dim glow from the closet always gave me some comfort, making the space feel just a little less eerie. As I was browsing game FAQs, something strange happened. All of the lights in my wing shut off at once. The band of light under the door, the only thing that reassured me, suddenly went black. My heart dropped into my stomach. I sat up in bed, frozen for a moment, staring at the door as though it held all the answers. The bedroom door was unlocked, and though I felt a strong urge to get up and lock it, fear kept me still. Before I could make a decision, the door slammed violently. It wasn't a gentle close. It was as if someone had kicked the bottom of the door with full force. I remember letting out a small, involuntary squeak of shock. It took me about 6 seconds to spring into action. I jumped to my feet and grabbed a blade I kept by my bedside, positioned only a few paces away from the door. I remember thinking that if the door opened, I would be ready to face whoever or whatever was on the other side. But the complete silence that followed was unnerving. What troubled me most was the absence of light beneath the door. Without it, I couldn't see the shadow of anyone standing outside. My imagination ran wild, picturing some dark figure standing in the hallway, waiting for the right moment to strike. Several minutes passed, and nothing happened. My mind wrestled with itself. Fear was urging me to stay hidden, but my instincts told me I couldn't sit still forever. I didn't have a phone in my room. My old Nokia was charging in another wing of the house, completely out of reach. So, with nothing but a knife in my hand and misplaced courage, I made my move. I threw the door open with a surge of adrenaline, my knife held low in my right hand, and my left arm up in a defensive position. I was ready for a confrontation, but there was nothing, just empty air. The hallway was still eerily quiet. Confused, I quickly flipped the hallway light switch, expecting some explanation, but found none. There was no one in my wing, no one in the entire house. The burglar alarm was still on and undisturbed. Every window and door was locked as it had been earlier. I searched every corner, under beds, in closets, behind furniture. Nothing. I felt a chill run down my spine as I stood in the now brightly lit hallway, my mind racing with questions. There was no explanation for what had happened. Slowly, I backed into my room, locking the door and sealing myself off once more. I left the lights on this time and sat on my bed, laptop still open but forgotten. I kept glancing at the door, which now had a slight bow in it, a lasting reminder of the violent force that had slammed it shut earlier. Hours dragged by and sleep was impossible. Around 3 a.m., the lights under the door dimmed again. My heart pounded in my chest. The entire wing was in darkness once more, and this time I was truly terrified. My knife, which had seemed like a decent form of defense earlier, now felt utterly useless. The reality of the situation began to sink in, and my previous bravery evaporated. Without thinking, I grabbed the bed and shoved it against the door. It was heavy, and moving it wasn't easy, but the effort felt necessary. The door opened inward, so I figured this would at least buy me some time if something, or someone, tried to get in. As I stood there, I felt a shift in the air. It was subtle, but it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It felt as though something was angry with me, though I had no idea why. In a panic, I retreated to the closet, the place that always felt safest to me as a child. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, surrounded by my clothes, my back pressed against the wall. Every creak in the house sent my imagination spiraling. Was there something on the other side of the door? I stayed like that until the sky started to lighten. The first rays of sunlight came through the skylight, casting a pale glow across the room. That was all I needed to find the strength to move. My fear seemed to dissolve as the daylight took over, and I finally pushed the bed away from the door. When I stepped out of my room, I noticed something odd. The wing door had been unlocked, but that wasn't possible. It required a key from the other side. I had locked it myself after the first incident. Just then, I heard footsteps coming down the stairs from the main part of the house. My dad was home. For a moment, I felt embarrassed, thinking I had made a big deal out of nothing. "Oh," I said, trying to laugh it off. "So it was you who turned all the lights off last night?" He gave me a strange look and replied, "What? I just got home 10 minutes ago." My stomach dropped. There was no explanation for what had happened that night. No logical reason. I still don't know what it was, but whatever it was, it seemed to like the dark and had a thing against doors. And it only ever seemed to appear in my wing of the house. Almost 20 years have passed since that night, and nothing like it ever happened again. My parents built the house from scratch, and no strange or tragic events had ever occurred there. Yet every time I visit, I see that bow in my bedroom door. It's still there, while my sister's door across the hall remains perfectly flush, just as it was when it was first installed. And despite everything, my mom is still with us. It was over 10 years ago when a friend and I visited Japan. It was our first time there, so we went with a tour company. However, after the tour ended, we decided to stay an extra night at a hotel in East Ikebukuro. During the tour, The guide would share stories of haunted hotels and other urban myths, as one does over beers or while enjoying a late-night onsen. One of the things he warned us about was to be cautious if we found a room where the head of the bed was positioned next to the window where, if you looked up while lying in bed, you'd see outside. He tried to scare us by saying that in such rooms, ghosts would come through the window at night and drag you out to your death. Back to the hotel in East Ikebukuro. We checked in during the early evening, and the first thing we noticed was how small the room was. The second thing was that they had given us a double bed instead of twin singles. And thirdly, the head of the bed was right next to the window. We rationalized that the room was too small to arrange the bed any other way, and dismissed the tour leader's stories as nonsense. To be honest, we were more annoyed that we had to share a double bed. We decided to let it go since it was just for one night, so we went out for dinner before turning in for the night. That night, I was woken up by a door slamming shut, and I jolted awake. There, sitting at the foot of the bed, was a woman in a blue kimono. She had long hair, and from what I could make out, her kimono had butterflies on it. I freaked out, dove under my pillow, and buried my head. Looking back, that was a useless move if anything bad were to happen. I remember thinking, is this real? How can I check without looking? In my genius, I decided to shuffle my foot down the bed, thinking if I didn't touch anything, it was just my imagination. I didn't think about what I'd do if I did touch something. Little by little, my foot moved down the bed when I noticed that there was definitely a depression at the foot of the bed. Someone or something was there. I quickly pulled my foot back, started to sweat, and began repeatedly saying the Lord's Prayer until I must have fainted or fallen back asleep. I remember waking up at 6 the next morning. My friend was already dressed and packed. I asked him if he saw or heard anything last night, and all he said was, "I don't want to talk about it. Let's check out." When I joined the military, I was stationed in Japan. On my very first night there, I woke up at 3 a.m. and saw a figure crawling on the ceiling. It had a long tongue, and when it noticed me, it laughed and then disappeared. I was so scared I couldn't go back to sleep. Months later, I told my friend's wife about the experience, and she explained that it was a ceiling oni, a spirit. She mentioned there are many such spirits. Using a Japanese keyboard, she searched for an image on Google and showed it to me. I swear it looked exactly like what I had seen. I've never been able to find the exact image again on Google. I'd probably need a Japanese keyboard to do it. Another time in Japan, I was walking home from the train around midnight. I had taken this route many times and never felt scared at night. Japan is very safe and quiet at night, serene and calm, at least around the military base. But on this night, signs and billboards were not where they usually were. They were gone. The buildings looked older or some weren't there at all. Everything seemed different. The streetlights, even though they were right in front of me, appeared distant, as if there was a film over them. I saw people outside doing chores, washing clothes, and cleaning a fish on a wooden block. This was at midnight. Nobody made a sound. By this point, I was practically running, convinced they were not from the world of the living. When I got near the base, the film faded away, and everything returned to normal. It was incredibly scary and left a lasting impact on me. I'll never forget that. I'm very much a skeptic when it comes to ghosts, so I still think there's probably some sort of explanation for this. But it was strange, and I still think about it from time to time. 17 years ago, when I first came to Japan on the JET program, I was sent to a small island. My apartment was quite old and run down, and it was located across the street from an old Buddhist temple with a graveyard. Every now and then, both my lights and my TV would turn on and off in the middle of the night. It usually woke me up, especially the TV, because at the time it was still analog, so it would just be static in the middle of the night. For some reason, the volume would always be up high, even though I never set it that way when I watched TV. I always thought that since the building was old, it was probably an issue with the electrical wiring or something like that. After living there for a few weeks, I befriended the elderly lady who was the mother of the monk running the temple across the street. I could speak a bit of Japanese, and she seemed lonely, so she quickly reached out to me. It was really nice. She would bring me fruits or rice from time to time, and she showed me where the convenience store and grocery store were on the island. She generally looked after me, making sure I was eating properly and taking care of myself. She was a very kind lady. As we got to know each other better, she started telling me that she could see dead people and that there were a lot of ghosts wandering around the temple and the surrounding areas, especially near my apartment building. Honestly, I thought she was probably just imagining things, but then my lights and TV did that thing where they turned on and off at night again, and it really unsettled me. One night, it happened again, and I was so freaked out that I yelled for it to stop, but it continued. So then, I yelled for it to stop in Japanese, and it stopped. That really scared me. I still think it was probably a coincidence, and there's likely a rational explanation for it, but I will say I was relieved when my time at Jet was over, and I could leave that apartment. I kept in contact with the elderly lady until she passed away a few years ago. I miss her. I'm very much a skeptic when it comes to ghosts, so I still think there's probably some sort of explanation for this. But it was strange, and I still think about it from time to time. 17 years ago, when I first came to Japan on the JET program, I was sent to a small island. My apartment was quite old and run down, and it was located across the street from an old Buddhist temple with a graveyard. Every now and then, both my lights and my TV would turn on and off in the middle of the night. It usually woke me up, especially the TV, because at the time it was still analog, so it would just be static in the middle of the night. For some reason, the volume would always be up high, even though I never set it that way when I watched TV. I always thought that since the building was old, it was probably an issue with the electrical wiring or something like that. After living there for a few weeks, I befriended the elderly lady who was the mother of the monk running the temple across the street. I could speak a bit of Japanese, and she seemed lonely, so she quickly reached out to me. It was really nice. She would bring me fruits or rice from time to time, and she showed me where the convenience store and grocery store were on the island. She generally looked after me, making sure I was eating properly and taking care of myself. She was a very kind lady. As we got to know each other better, she started telling me that she could see dead people and that there were a lot of ghosts wandering around the temple and the surrounding areas, especially near my apartment building. Honestly, I thought she was probably just imagining things, but then my lights and TV did that thing where they turned on and off at night again, and it really unsettled me. One night, it happened again, and I was so freaked out that I yelled for it to stop, but it continued. So then, I yelled for it to stop in Japanese, and it stopped. That really scared me. I still think it was probably a coincidence, and there's likely a rational explanation for it, but I will say I was relieved when my time at Jet was over, and I could leave that apartment. I kept in contact with the elderly lady until she passed away a few years ago. I miss her. I'm very much a skeptic when it comes to ghosts, so I still think there's probably some sort of explanation for this. But it was strange, and I still think about it from time to time. 17 years ago, when I first came to Japan on the JET program, I was sent to a small island. My apartment was quite old and run down, and it was located across the street from an old Buddhist temple with a graveyard. Every now and then, both my lights and my TV would turn on and off in the middle of the night. It usually woke me up, especially the TV, because at the time it was still analog, so it would just be static in the middle of the night. For some reason, the volume would always be up high, even though I never set it that way when I watched TV. I always thought that since the building was old, it was probably an issue with the electrical wiring or something like that. After living there for a few weeks, I befriended the elderly lady who was the mother of the monk running the temple across the street. I could speak a bit of Japanese, and she seemed lonely, so she quickly reached out to me. It was really nice. She would bring me fruits or rice from time to time, and she showed me where the convenience store and grocery store were on the island. She generally looked after me, making sure I was eating properly and taking care of myself. She was a very kind lady. As we got to know each other better, she started telling me that she could see dead people and that there were a lot of ghosts wandering around the temple and the surrounding areas, especially near my apartment building. Honestly, I thought she was probably just imagining things, But then my lights and TV did that thing where they turned on and off at night again, and it really unsettled me. One night, it happened again, and I was so freaked out that I yelled for it to stop, but it continued. So then, I yelled for it to stop in Japanese, and it stopped. That really, really scared me. I still think it was probably a coincidence, and there's likely a rational explanation for it, but I will say I was relieved when my time at Jet was over, and I could leave that apartment. I kept in contact with the elderly lady until she passed away a few years ago. I miss her. Many years ago, I used to teach English in the evenings in Japan. Many of my classes were held at various temples and shrines, as these spaces were often used for community activities. It was around 11:30 p.m. after my last lesson with a student. Once she left, it was my responsibility to vacuum the room and turn off the lights. That evening, as I entered the room with the vacuum, I noticed several decorated drums and portable shrines I hadn't seen before. They were being stored there in preparation for an upcoming festival. When I opened the door, I saw the items moving slightly, but I assumed it was due to the vibrations from the door and carried on with my tasks. I usually try to avoid thinking about unsettling things and just ignore them if they happen. I turned off all the lights, except for the one near the entrance, before returning the vacuum to the storage room. As I opened the door to the storage room, the large drums began to boom loudly in rhythm, and the portable shrines started making noise as well, with the smaller drums on them adding to the commotion. Overwhelmed by the cacophony, I was too frightened to look. I quickly fled the building and ran to my car, only to remember that I hadn't locked up. Determined not to get in trouble, I called my husband and kept him on speakerphone while I hurried back to the temple. With trembling fingers, I managed to lock the door, all the while still hearing the drums from outside. Fortunately, I managed to get out safely, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was playing tricks on me. Since then, people have asked if I ever saw any ghosts at the temples, as in Japan, it's believed that ghosts come out at temples at night. I never mentioned that incident and simply said no. I'm fairly certain it wasn't an earthquake, as the noise from the drums seemed as if someone was hitting them rather than just rattling. Also, I didn't feel any tremors, and the noise continued longer than a typical earthquake would last. It felt like the commotion was specifically related to me opening the door and entering the room, with the initial rattles serving as a warning and escalating when I returned, urging me to leave. Anyone who has spent time on the Navajo reservation has likely heard unsettling stories or experienced eerie events, often involving skinwalkers. I have encountered one myself. Here is my story. I come from a small town in northern Arizona, nestled between the Paiute Reservation to the north and the Navajo Reservation to the south. My high school was very small, with only about 80 students enrolled each year. So we often had to travel south for 5 to 10 hours to play other schools and sports. This meant frequent trips through the Navajo Reservation. Usually, we stayed in hotels overnight, but this trip was different. Our basketball coach explained that the school didn't have enough money to cover staying at a hotel, so we would be on the road for about 12 hours straight. That season, I was the only senior boy on the basketball team. After our game, we headed home on our big blue bus. We had been driving for about 2 hours and had entered the reservation when I noticed something unusual. Everyone else was asleep. It was around 2 in the morning, but the bus driver had sped up to 85 miles per hour, which was odd since he never exceeded the speed limit. I couldn't fall asleep like my teammates, so I sat at the back of the bus, staring out at the moonlit desert landscape. Suddenly, I saw a figure running toward the bus at an angle, keeping pace with us at 85 miles per hour. As it got closer, I realized it was humanoid. I remember it had a face painted half black and half white and glowing eyes. Those were like a rabbit's eyes reflecting light. I immediately thought that must be a skinwalker. The skinwalker kept pace with the bus, leaping over sagebrush and rocks. Its eyes were locked on mine. I couldn't look away, as if something was holding my head and eyes in place. It smiled at me with an inhuman grin that stretched from ear to ear, revealing crooked yellow and pointed teeth. This is when I felt nauseous and panicked. The skinwalker then dropped to all fours, its bones cracking and reforming, hair sprouting all over its body. In about 3 seconds, it had transformed into a coyote and ran off into the desert. As soon as it was gone, I rushed to the onboard bathroom and vomited. I didn't tell anyone at first, fearing they would think I was crazy. Eventually, I confided in my Navajo friend who told me I needed a blessing from the chief. The next school day, I saw the chief in the parking lot. He approached me, muttered something in Navajo while waving a feathered scepter, then turned and drove away. Since then, I haven't seen another skinwalker. It might be because whenever I had to travel south, I'd take a long detour. I heard this story from my dad once. He's always been honest and straightforward, so I believe every word. It was the early 1980s, and my sister who lived in Montreal came down to visit our parents for the weekend. She was staying at a friend's house who lent her a car for the visit. After spending some time with our parents, she left around 9 p.m. She had only driven about 7 to 8 miles when the car broke down. Luckily, it happened right in front of a family friend's house. They welcomed her in and let her call Dad, who came to pick her up. The family offered to let her leave the car in their driveway overnight, and my sister decided to stay at our parents' place. By the time they were driving back, it was a little after 10 p.m. and completely dark as it was late in October. As my sister and Dad drove through a densely wooded area, they suddenly heard an incredibly loud, eerie scream that cut through the sound of the engine, their conversation, and the radio. Dad slammed on the brakes, and they both panicked. Out of nowhere, a 6-foot-tall creature resembling a coyote, walking on 2 legs with a black and white striped tail, appeared on the side of the road and crossed in front of the car. As soon as it passed, the same scream echoed again, only this time much louder. Dad hit the accelerator, and they sped away from there as fast as they could. They never saw it again. One time, I went camping with 2 friends who weren't very familiar with the outdoors. I was introducing them to camping and hiking. I love exploring and not just walking along trails as I find them monotonous. We ventured a couple of miles from our campsite, but my friends soon wanted to head back. I agreed and showed them the way on my phone, setting a waypoint on the GPS for them to follow. They insisted on taking the pistol I had for safety, leaving me with just some water. I didn't mind and decided to continue exploring on my own. After walking about 5 miles from camp, I found a steep hillside covered in rocks and decided to descend. At the bottom, I followed what appeared to be a dry riverbed. As I moved further south, the terrain grew steeper. Suddenly, I felt an overwhelming sense of unease. I started scanning my surroundings and noticed a large log stretched across the 2 hillsides. As I crouched down to crawl under it, the sensation of being watched intensified. I glanced to my left and saw nothing. Then I looked around the riverbed before turning to my right. There I saw a massive black canine. It was too small to be a bear, yet it looked like an oversized wolf. We locked eyes for what felt like hours, though it was likely only seconds. The feeling of dread grew with each passing moment. I began to slowly retreat, and as I did, the creature bolted into the forest, moving away from the camp. In hindsight, it moved faster than any animal I had ever seen. Back in the day, my aunt and her friends were known for their wild nights out. They'd pile into an old dilapidated van and head out to the remote areas of the Navajo reservation after dark. It was their routine to drink and have a blast under the stars. One night, as usual, they were out there enjoying themselves when the unexpected happened. Amid their laughter and chatter, they suddenly heard what sounded like stones being thrown at their van. The mood shifted instantly. Everyone fell silent and puzzled by the strange noise. The rock throwing ceased, but then, something heavy landed on the van's roof without warning. Panic erupted as they realized something was terribly wrong. They scrambled to lock all the doors. My aunt took charge, jumped into the driver's seat, and tried to start the engine. But as fate would have it, the old van refused to cooperate. The thing on the roof continued its relentless pounding as if it were jumping up and down. In the midst of the chaos, my aunt glimpsed a hand with long, claw-like nails reaching over the edge of the roof and scratching the windshield. Just then, the entity on the roof leaped off. My aunt kept struggling with the engine amid the screams and frantic cries from her friends to get the van moving. Then, as if straight out of a nightmare, she saw a skinwalker appear beside the driver's side window. Its eyes locked onto her just inches away. That was when my aunt, overwhelmed with fear, dove into the back of the van and began praying fervently. After what felt like an eternity, the skinwalker finally disappeared. With a deep breath, my aunt climbed back into the driver's seat, managed to get the van started, and sped away from the terrifying encounter. She couldn't describe exactly what they saw that night, but they all agreed it seemed like a dog standing upright. Its arms seemed human, except it was very hairy and had long fingers with long nails. When I was younger, something unsettling happened that I've never quite forgotten. My uncle and I were finishing up gathering firewood for my grandmother as twilight descended. As we drove back on a gravel road at around 30 miles per hour, I felt an eerie sensation that we were being watched. Before I could glance out the window from the passenger seat, my uncle urgently shouted at me, "Don't look outside." I was paralyzed with fear and my heart was pounding fiercely. It felt like it stopped entirely when I heard a series of taps on my window. My uncle accelerated as he was fervently praying in our native language. I was bewildered, thinking the danger had passed until the truck jolted from the rear. My uncle kept repeating that I should look at him and to never look away. Then I heard it again. There were a couple of taps, but this time, these were coming from the window behind me. The anxiety was suffocating and tears welled up in my eyes. After a minute or so, the truck dipped once more. My uncle surveyed the surroundings and sighed in relief. The only sound was the truck and the road. He turned to me and said that we'll ask my father to say a prayer in the morning so that the malevolent presence will forget us. I remember curling up on the seat, focusing on the radio and watching the time tick by. I listened to my uncle as he softly chanted an old prayer until we reached my grandmother's house. Years later, I had a nightmare about that incident. I called my uncle and we reminisced about the event. He told me that he didn't exactly see faces on the truck window. What he saw was only eyes watching me, glowing like brake lights on the road. I tried to lighten the mood with a joke and asked him why didn't he just brake when the thing was in the back. He didn't laugh. He just paused before he replied, "Because it wasn't alone." This was when I used to visit my cousin's place in South Dakota. If you look the place up on Google Maps, you'll see it's a vast open plain. It's not unusual for people to report sightings of spirits there, and I remember having a few unsettling experiences myself. To reach my cousin's house, you'd have to drive 20 minutes from the main road. Her cabin was near a dense forest, making it very secluded, with the nearest neighbor about 10 minutes away by car and 30 minutes on foot. There were no streetlights, and if you needed to use the bathroom, you had to walk to the outhouse. It's about a 3-minute trek from the house. At night, a flashlight was essential because it was pitch black. One night, my cousin, her mom, and I stayed in the cabin that they let us use. We had come to the res to deliver some documents to the tribal office, so my cousin and I decided to make a trip of it. Late at night, as we watched TV, we heard scratching noises at the windows in the back room. We panicked because the door to that room was open and the blinds were up. We ran to close the blinds without looking outside, figuring it might be a spirit. Her mom was asleep, so we made sure to lock the doors and tried to ignore the noises all night. We waited until dawn to use the bathroom, and even then, we went together and kept the radio on from our phones to stay calm. The next morning, I remember her mom making coffee while we talked in the living room when one of the plates suddenly fell. Then, my cousin noticed that the car doors were open even though we remembered locking them. Nothing seemed too alarming until her mom discovered our tires were slashed. Also, the windows appeared to have some kind of claw marks on them. When we told her mom about our experience the night before, she said it was likely a spirit, but assured us that she had placed protective herbs around the doorways before nightfall. That was what kept it from entering the house. She essentially safeguarded the house with a quick protection prayer. It was a frightening experience, and spirits are not to be taken lightly. I've had my share of encounters and have heard many stories from my parents about their experiences. Please, if you visit reservations at night, never go alone or leave your belongings outside. They can be taken and used to cast a curse on you. According to the locals, it could be fatal if you don't see a medicine man. Many years ago, when I was 21, I worked as a camp counselor at a remote summer camp nestled in the woods of Fishkill. The camp consisted of several cabins spread out on a mountain, each one about a half-mile from the next, creating a sense of isolation. One night around 1 a.m., I was sneaking out to meet my camp girlfriend, which was against the rules since we were supposed to stay in our cabins after 10 p.m. I was making my way through the woods to get to her cabin when I heard rustling nearby. Expecting it to be a bear or another animal, I paused to investigate. To my surprise, a 3-foot-tall humanoid figure emerged from the bushes. It was too dark to see any distinct features, but it stood on 2 legs and had 2 arms, resembling a miniature person. Its entire body appeared solid black, without any noticeable clothing or other details. Intrigued, I began to approach the figure, but it bolted back into the woods. The way it moved was astonishingly mechanical, like someone performing the robot dance as its body seemed to shift 90 degrees before it sprinted away. I had never seen anything run that fast on 2 legs. Despite being a fit and fast runner myself, I couldn't hope to match its speed. To this day, I can't explain what I saw. It looked human but was too short to be a person. I also can't imagine a human running that fast. The memory of that night has always puzzled me, and I often think about returning to the camp to try and find that mysterious creature again. During my second term in January, I worked as a lab student in Alert, Nunavut. Look it up, it's the northernmost inhabited place on Earth. It was the height of winter, and the world outside was shrouded in complete darkness. The atmospheric lab where I worked was located about 5 kilometers from the main base, and to reach our instruments, we followed lifelines marked by ropes strung between them. On one particularly blustery Wednesday, which was our designated day for collecting samples, the weather was a bit stormy but manageable. As the student, it was my responsibility to handle the flasking duties outside. I'd load a sleigh with evacuated flasks and trudge about 300 meters away from the lab, open the flasks to capture air samples, and then return to the lab. The samples were then sent south for analysis. To ensure the best possible samples, we always walked into the wind, which meant navigating without the lifelines. On this Wednesday, equipped with my headlamp, I ventured out into the profound darkness. A few hundred meters from the lab, everything suddenly went pitch black. I turned around, only to realize the lab, the station, and even the parking area had vanished into the void. I was alone, with nothing but a headlamp and a sleigh full of empty flasks. Panic set in. Without a radio or phone, which often didn't work in that remote area, and with no visible tracks to follow, I felt completely disoriented. My heart raced as I braced myself for the worst. I feared this might be the end. After what felt like an eternity of 2 minutes, the power flickered back on. I have a workspace in an old, former asylum that was originally built by monks and later transformed into a hospital during World War II. The building carries a heavy, eerie history. It's massive, with long, shadowy hallways and stern 1920s architecture. Brick archways loom overhead, and there are unsettling sculptures of monks that have long since vanished. I usually work late, often until 3 in the morning, and I'm typically the last person to leave. One winter night, After finishing up, I locked my office and headed towards the exit. The building was completely dark, and the wind outside was howling. Suddenly, I heard the sound of running footsteps echoing in the distance. Many footsteps, as if a group was sprinting through the corridors. Then silence. As I descended a flight of stairs, I caught a glimpse of small red lights blinking at the far end of a long, dark hallway. They flickered for just a moment before disappearing. By this point, I was thoroughly unnerved and quickened my pace towards the exit. Just as I turned a corner, the running footsteps returned, louder this time. I turned around, and before I could react, a group of kids suddenly screamed right in my face. My heart nearly stopped. It turned out they were playing a game of laser tag. One of their parents had lent them the keys to the building, and they were running around with their laser guns, the red lights I had seen earlier. They thought the place was empty and were just as shocked to see me, a tall figure in a trench coat, appear out of nowhere in the dark. I worked as an assistant in a morgue where, as a medical student, I had the opportunity to examine the bodies donated to the university. These bodies were kept in a massive walk-in freezer, which was equipped with a motion sensor system. If someone were to become trapped inside, an alarm would sound, alerting others to come and assist. On one occasion, I was working alone while my instructor was occupied with paperwork in a nearby building. I heard a lot of commotion, but I initially thought it might be coming from my instructor's office. Suddenly, the alarm blared, sending a jolt of fear through me. I panicked, thinking that my instructor might be trapped inside the freezer. As I rushed toward the freezer, my instructor unexpectedly appeared and grabbed my arm, saying, "I thought you were the one stuck inside the freezer." We both stood there, staring at the door, while he turned off the alarm and unlocked it. I stayed behind him, nervously holding a broom, ready for anything. When the freezer door finally opened, we found nothing that could have triggered the motion sensor. There was no one inside, at least no one living. I once worked as a security guard at an abandoned hotel that sat right on the riverbank. The building had seen better days, with its rooms once boasting balconies that extended over the water. The hotel had been closed down for a while, and the owners had stripped it of nearly everything valuable. One quiet night, I was sitting in the security office when I heard a faint creaking noise. It sounded like footsteps moving from left to right on the floor above me. The hotel was built with a wooden frame, and the creaking reminded me of an old house settling under someone's weight. It sounded exactly like someone was walking down the hallway directly above where I was sitting. Curiosity and duty got the better of me, so I grabbed my flashlight and headed up to the next floor. The hotel was only 4 stories high but stretched out quite a distance, so the hallways seemed to go on forever. As I stepped into the hallway, I noticed the bare walls, the empty rooms without doors, and a single dim light bulb hanging from the ceiling in the middle of the corridor. I've watched enough horror movies to know that this situation was a red flag, but I kept walking down the hall. It was my job, after all, to make sure no one was trespassing. About a quarter of the way down the hallway, I heard a rustling noise coming from one of the rooms. I instinctively tightened my grip on my mag light, preparing for whatever might be inside. Cautiously, I peeked into the room, only to discover that the wind from the river was blowing in through a broken window, causing the tattered remains of a curtain to flutter. A bit shaken, I decided to check the other floors, but I found nothing out of the ordinary. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was in the building with me. Eventually, I made my way back down to the ground floor and wandered into the old ballroom. The space was wide open, with nothing but shadows and echoes to keep me company. As I scanned the room, I suddenly caught movement out of the corner of my eye. My heart raced as I spun around and aimed my flashlight, ready to defend myself. But when the beam of light hit the figure, I realized it was just my own reflection in a shattered mirror on the wall. That was enough for me. I decided to spend the rest of my shift in the safety of my car, parked outside. A couple of weeks later, the hotel burned down. To this day, I still believe there was someone or something in that building with me that night, though I never found any evidence to prove it. I work in a highly secured building due to the valuable equipment we store. To reach my office, you must pass through 4 doors, each requiring a key card to access. The environment is very quiet and sterile. White walls, minimal furniture, gray floors, and an open ceiling exposing the ducts. The sound here tends to echo. One night, while I was working alone, I noticed someone else in the building. He wore a shirt similar to those worn by maintenance staff, but it was quite unusual because it was very late on a Saturday. He was also wearing jeans, whereas maintenance staff typically wear black pants. His presence unsettled me, so I locked my office door and stayed put. I could hear him pacing back and forth and trying the handle of my office door a couple of times. I also heard the beep of him attempting to use a keycard to unlock my door. Turned out that he wasn't actually employed there. He was the adult son of one of the workers, wandering the building in an attempt to steal items. His father's keycard, meant for handymen with restricted access, was ineffective at opening office doors. Handymen require appointments and must be let in, unlike cleaning staff or techs who have broader access. Security reviewed the footage and saw the attempted access and traced it back to his father's keycard. As a result, the son received a fine for trespassing, and his father lost his job. I used to work as a night cleaner at a large movie theater. Our shift officially began at 4 a.m., and we would clean until the doors opened at 11 a.m. To save time and keep our jobs, we'd sometimes arrive just as the last screenings were wrapping up and catch some sleep in one of the empty theaters, making sure we were up and ready by the start of our shift. Our usual routine involved using electric leaf blowers to clear the aisles, sending popcorn and trash flying down to the bottom where we could easily collect it. Then, we would manually clean the seats for any leftover debris or anything particularly gross. This method was efficient but incredibly loud, so it was easy to get lost in the noise and focus on the task at hand. The theaters were fully lit to make cleaning easier, and typically, we were the only ones in the building at that hour. Whenever something odd happened, we would usually just blame it on each other. But there was one rule we all followed without exception: stay out of the projection booth. There was no need to go up there. We didn't clean it, all our supplies were on the main floor, and most importantly, the place had a reputation for being haunted. There's something about theaters and projection booths. No matter what, you always get the eerie feeling that someone's watching you. Imagine this: you're half deaf from the noise of the blowers, cleaning an empty theater, and you glance up at the projection booth, only to see someone standing there and staring at you. It's enough to make your heart skip a beat, especially when you step out into the hallway and find your coworker busy in another theater. Then, you both decide to check the exits at either end of the building, hoping to catch whoever it was, only to find no one. We decided it was best not to mess with it. I used to work the night shift at a large hardware store. There was a period when our store decided to stay open 24 hours for about a week. It wasn't really an issue most of the time. People generally don't shop for home improvement items at 3 in the morning, except for that one couple who came in at 2 a.m. looking for kitchen tiles. And then there was the young woman who wandered in just after midnight, right after my first break, searching for a very specific type of light fixture. She was dressed in denim shorts and a traditional white martial arts uniform with a black belt. She was oddly particular about which fixture she wanted. But the real story involves the insulation aisle. It was close to 3 a.m., and I was with a coworker stocking insulation and tidying up the aisles. A pile of large insulation rolls had toppled over, and as I was sorting through them, a hand suddenly shot out from the mess and grabbed my arm. I freaked out so badly that my coworker panicked too, and even our supervisor, who was on the other side of the store, came running to see what was happening. It turned out that a homeless man had somehow entered the store earlier, probably before the night crew started, and decided to make himself a cozy little nest in the insulation. He was in rough shape, clearly intoxicated, and we had to call the police to help get him out. After that incident, I was definitely more cautious around the insulation. At least for the rest of the time, the store stayed open 24 hours. In October of 2016, I encountered what I believed to be an extraterrestrial inside my house. It was a normal Friday evening at first. I was in college and was living with my dad at the time. He had gone to sleep at about 10 p.m., and I stayed up until around midnight. I turned off my TV and went to lay on my bed, where I promptly pulled out my phone and began browsing Reddit. This lasted for about 45 minutes before I finally decided to go to sleep. I realized that my throat felt a little dry, so I got up to get some water from the fridge. My room used to be a second living room off the kitchen, so there's no door on the frame except for a thick curtain. As I approached the curtain, everything was normal. The only thing that seemed a little off was how quiet it was. No crickets or cicadas were chirping outside, which there always were. It was quite unusual since I live in a secluded country ranch house. I could still hear my dad's white noise maker in his bedroom, though. I pulled the curtain aside to step out into the kitchen and experienced the single most terrifying thing in my entire life. Behind the curtain was what I believed to be an extraterrestrial. It was facing the hallway to my dad's room, and it was in a crouched position. We had a nightlight plugged in right above the kitchen countertop, so I assume it was trying to avoid that light. Its skin color was a sort of dark and metallic gray. As I pulled the curtain all the way back, the alien turned his head sharply to look at me. I gasped and was immediately overcome by an immense sense of dread and terror. I was quite literally paralyzed by fear. It stared at me for a couple of seconds, and then everything went black. I regained consciousness an hour later and was lying on top of my bed, the covers still made. My heart was pounding, and it felt like it was beating 1,000,000 times a minute. I saw something on my left, which was the darkest part of my room, and had a door leading to our carport. Standing over my bed were 3 dark gray figures. They were tall, and their heads were nearly touching the 7-foot ceiling in my room. I turned my head, stared at them, and began to experience the same sense of terror as before. It was the exact same sense of dread and paralysis. I was unable to move, unable to speak, and unable to do anything except look. This time they looked at me for much longer than a couple of seconds. Felt like it lasted a full minute or more. At the end of that minute, the being in the middle leaned in a little bit and moved its hand toward my foot. Tapped its finger on my foot 3 times slowly. Each time it tapped, a strange sensation pulsed through my body. It was just a weird energy that I can't really describe. After the 3rd pulse subsided, the being stood straight again, and then everything went black again. I regained consciousness yet again a minute or 2 later. I was still on top of my bed, covers still made, and I immediately began to cry. I don't mean just a tear or 2. I mean that I was literally just bawling my eyes out for the next few minutes. Eventually, all that emotion subsided, and I grabbed my phone from my bedside table. It was almost 2 a.m. I didn't end up going to sleep at all that night. I just sort of sat there on my bed trying to explain to myself what just happened. In the years since this has happened, I've yet to come up with an explanation that doesn't involve aliens, demons, ghosts, or some sort of paranormal phenomenon. I thought of sleep paralysis at first, but I never went to sleep before I saw the first one. I was wide awake still when I went to get a drink of water. I wasn't dreaming because I hadn't yet gone to sleep. When the 3 came right after I thought that, it could be sleep paralysis since I woke up on my bed and was unable to move or even scream when they looked at me. But how did I get in bed when the last thing I remember was looking at the first one in my kitchen? I know you hallucinate when experiencing sleep paralysis, but how did I see 3 distinct beings that essentially remained motionless? And what the hell was that sensation whenever it tapped my foot? If it was sleep paralysis, I've never had it before, and I haven't had it since. If it was some sort of spontaneous mental breakdown, I've never had one before and haven't had one since. If it was just some bad nightmare, when did I go from browsing Reddit and getting a drink of water to asleep and having a nightmare? Every time I think about it, I get an uneasy feeling just thinking about the dread I felt that night. It makes me feel squirmy and nervous. That night felt like death, but I don't know if whatever was in my house or whatever I imagined was malevolent. I don't know if they hurt me or did anything to me or my dad. I don't know if I was crazy, sleep deprived, or actually encountered aliens in my house. I've seen and felt some strange things before and after, including lost time. I've also seen what I believe to be UFOs and animals on the ranch we live on being mutilated. The lost time thing was a little freaky. I was texting my brother about Fallout 4 in the middle of the morning. I was in the middle of a response, lying on the bed in my room when time seemed to skip. All of a sudden, I was sitting on the couch in the first living room, opposite the kitchen to my bedroom. 7 whole hours had passed, and I didn't remember any of it. There were 2 texts from my brother about an hour apart. The first of which was him asking if I got his text. Then the second was just a couple of question marks. I was confused and didn't really know what to do. The UFOs thing is self-explanatory. I've seen lights fly over my house in the night. There is an airport about an hour away and I see planes on occasion, but these lights are always either too fast to be a plane, too slow to be a plane, or too quiet to be a low-flying helicopter. The animal mutilation thing is the saddest part for me. I have about 10 barn cats that I feed regularly. They keep away rattlesnakes and bugs and whatnot. Most of them are spayed or neutered and vaccinated, but new ones show up still and get pregnant somehow. Every so often, one of them gets killed by a mountain lion, stray dog, coyote, or by other cats. It's gruesome, but it happens. However, there have been a couple in the past few months that have made no sense and all have been the same way. They would have a single cut down the middle of their bodies, running from their jaw all the way to their genitalia. The cut goes all the way through their sternum and everything. It's always perfectly straight, and none of their internal organs or anything is damaged. It's like someone took a razor or something and slit them. We found them on our driveway and the private road leading to our driveway. There's never any blood, and the cat is just dead on the ground, already in rigor mortis. It makes no sense, and it makes me sad because I've raised most of those cats since they were kittens. This story is unfortunately true. I've changed names and ages slightly for privacy. I grew up in the Sierra Nevadas. It's a beautiful part of the world, with sprawling pines, rugged mountains, and crystalline lakes. I wasn't big on camping, but I spent a good part of my childhood weekends hiking with family and friends. Many summer days were spent tubing on the lake. The summer I turned 16, about 10 years ago, my cousin Celia came back from her first year of college, and her boyfriend, Jay, was visiting to meet her family and friends. Jay, like most tourists, wanted to go on a hike with lake views. Celia and I decided to take him on one of our favorites, a moderate hike through the woods on a gentle incline that peaks at a hollow in the trees overlooking Lake Tahoe. Jay had some hiking experience, albeit in less rugged terrain, and we thought this hike would be a fun challenge with the spectacular views he wanted. It's an in-and-out trail that takes about 2 to 3 hours to the top and 2 to 3 hours back down. There are some smaller trails that branch off, offering steeper inclines or winding paths down towards the lake. The 3 of us set off on the hike on the first Saturday of Jay's visit. The trail isn't the easiest to find, but it's really popular with locals because of the view and the general lack of tourists. It was mislabeled on the most popular trails website at the time, so it was hard to find if you didn't know where to look. We passed only a couple of other hikers, mostly granola-type couples with camelback water backpacks, hiking with their dogs. We made it to the top in good time and enjoyed our lunches while overlooking the lake. Jay was impressed by the views and spent a lot of time taking pictures. Between selfies and bites of sandwiches, we mostly relaxed and got to know each other. After about an hour of relaxing, we heard a scream in the distance, specifically a mountain lion scream. If you've never heard a mountain lion scream, it's unnerving. It sounds like a loud, terrified woman letting out a blood-curdling shriek. You should look it up on YouTube. It's truly a horrible sound. This was not good. When a mountain lion screams, it's either part of a mating ritual or 2 males are fighting. Either way, hearing one meant there were multiple mountain lions nearby. The bears in the Sierras are softies, but mountain lions will attack. They've even been known to attack bikers. There's safety in numbers, but even 3 people are at risk if you're dealing with a hungry lion. Jay was really freaked out. There weren't any large predators where he was from, and the thought of an animal willing to eat him was disturbing. Celia and I were wary but not alarmed. Between the natural disasters in the region, earthquakes, wildfires, blizzards, and the sometimes deadly wild animals, we were fairly unshakable. We'd seen plenty of bears and snakes on hikes, and sometimes encountering critters is just part of enjoying nature. It wasn't the first time we had heard mountain lions, and we had both seen them before, mostly from the safety of a cabin or house. There was even a time, as kids, when we laid out expensive stakes in my backyard, hoping to lure a mountain lion to take pictures. It didn't work, and my mother was not happy about the stakes. Anyway, Celia and I told Jay that we needed to pack up and head back down the mountain. We packed up our lunch and set off at a brisk pace. About 40 minutes into the hike back, Jay realized he'd forgotten his phone at the lookout. After a brief back and forth between Jay and Celia, we decided to go back and get it. Celia and Jay would hike back up to retrieve the phone, and I would stay on the trail to warn other hikers about the lions. I was mostly worried about hikers with off-leash dogs and wanted to prevent a wandering lab from getting mauled. It wasn't ideal, but it seemed like the best choice. I found a nice rock to sit on in the shade, just off the trail. I was going through the pictures on my phone and playing Temple Run. There was no cell service, but I figured they'd be back soon. Celia and Jay had been gone for about 50 minutes when I heard the scream again. It was hard to tell, but it seemed closer than before. I started to get nervous. Being in a group is far safer when dealing with mountain lions, and sitting alone in the woods made me feel like perfect bait. About 20 minutes later, I heard the scream again, and this time, it was definitely closer. It sounded like it was coming from up the trail, towards where Celia and Jay would be coming down soon. I really hoped. I knew lions don't scream when hunting. They're quiet then. If one was hunting me, I wouldn't hear it. The screaming meant something else, but that didn't make me feel any better. I became hyper alert, whipping my head around at every noise or movement. I turned on my flashlight, even though it was daytime. I stood in the middle of the trail to keep visibility in all directions. A few minutes later, I heard the scream again, much closer. By now, I had goosebumps, a pit in my stomach, and a growing sense of dread. I looked around, trying to find the best spot to stand in case things got bad. I wedged myself against a tree next to the rock I had been sitting on. I could still see up and down the trail and into the trees. Suddenly, I saw something. Standing still about 20 feet up the trail was a man. He was completely naked, filthy, and skinny. He just stood there, looking at me. I didn't hear him come up. It was like he appeared out of nowhere, especially since I had been watching in that direction for the lion. If you don't know the area, it's easy to get lost. People can panic and get more lost trying to find their way back. It doesn't take long for someone to become disoriented and a bit crazy. The infamous Donner Party incident happened maybe an hour from where I was. My first thought was that this man was a lost hiker. Judging by how dirty he was, he'd been lost for a while. He probably needed help. I'd heard of people with hypothermia stripping off their clothes, and I thought that's what might have happened. It was summer, though, so hypothermia didn't make sense. I started walking towards him, asking if he was okay. Suddenly, I got this overwhelming feeling of wrongness. I can't describe it, but the dread tripled, and the hairs on my neck stood up. I stopped, now about 15 feet away, and had the urge to run. Everything about him seemed wrong. Instead of wanting to help, I was terrified. I asked again if he was okay. He looked at me, then opened his mouth and screamed. It wasn't a normal scream. He screamed like the mountain lion. It was a high-pitched, keening shriek that made my blood run cold. I realized we'd probably been hearing him the whole time. It was the most terrifying thing I've ever seen. I screamed too. I was ready to run down the trail, but I didn't want to turn my back on him. Suddenly, he closed his mouth, turned around, and ran into the woods, quickly disappearing into the trees. The feeling of wrongness stayed with me, and I felt like I might throw up. I considered running down the trail, but decided to wait for Celia and Jay. Thankfully, they arrived about 10 or 15 minutes later. I told them what happened, and we decided to call it in to the rangers once we got service. Celia and I had seen odd things in our lives, but she turned pale when I told her what happened. Apparently, they hadn't heard or seen anything on the way down. I've been deeply unsettled ever since. I'm not the type of person to believe in this kind of stuff, especially because I'm not superstitious at all. But these two encounters made me doubt whatever is going on at this farm. The first encounter happened when my two friends and I were having dinner. Everything was calm. We were eating outside since it's a relatively big space. Then we heard a woman scream. This was extremely odd because the country I live in is very peaceful, with little crime or even animal attacks, especially in the wilderness. I was the first to react. I climbed the wall that separated the house grounds from the animal area. From there, I could see almost all the houses nearby. My friends followed shortly after. We stood in total silence, waiting for another scream. We heard it again. This time, we could make out what she said. "Help!" she yelled, followed by a bunch of gibberish we couldn't understand. One of my friends quickly grabbed the phone to call the police, assuming it could be domestic violence or a robbery. I grabbed my axe, and my other friend joined me at the gate. We didn't leave, though. Something about those screams felt off. Right before the police arrived, we heard a thud and then the sound of glass breaking. I assumed it was a window. As soon as the police showed up, the screams stopped and were never heard again. The police found nothing. Later that night, my friends and I stayed up talking about what happened. One of them was oddly quiet. When I asked what was wrong, he simply said, "I've heard those screams before." Apparently, he had heard that woman scream a few times while walking his dog. The next day, we got up and decided to check the house where the screams came from. But when we arrived, something weird happened. There was no house. It was just forest terrain, filled with big trees and bushes. We went back home and decided to forget about it since we wanted to have a good time. No one would connect this encounter to a skinwalker, and neither did I at first. But when it happened a second time, I started to piece things together. The second encounter happened when my cousins were visiting. Like the previous night, we were having a peaceful dinner. My cousin and I decided to go for a walk in the garden. The garden bordered a large forest, separated only by a small stone wall. We were talking and laughing when I suddenly heard a man's voice. It didn't sound normal. There was something strange about it, like something was stuck in his throat, making his voice sound weird. I grabbed my axe again, and my cousin called his sister. We moved closer to the wall to hear him better. Like the first encounter, we could only understand gibberish. He wouldn't stop talking, not even to catch his breath. After listening for a while, we realized there was nothing we could do, so we left and finished our dinner. My cousins went home, and I found myself alone. It was unsettling. I started overthinking. I remembered how my dog used to spend entire nights barking at that forest, even though the hunters had wiped out all the animals there. I remembered the warnings my parents gave me as a child, to always leave the forest and lock all the doors before sunset. They never told me why, and I never understood the worry. We lived in such a calm, quiet place. Everything ended when the lumberjacks came to cut down the grown trees, making the forest visible. Before that, you couldn't see anything in there even during the day. After the trees were gone and the weather improved, nothing strange happened again, and my dog stopped barking at the wall. It happened somewhere between 1997 and 1999. I was in my late teens and we were living in New Mexico near the Four Corners. My parents were pastors at a local church in a very small town. We lived outside of town in the middle of nowhere with only a few houses scattered around us. Where there were no houses, the land was covered with brush and a lot of desert. Ever since we moved there, the locals told us about skinwalkers. Even people in the church warned us about them. One guy from church swore that when he was a truck driver, he saw a skinwalker in its human form running alongside his truck while he was going about 80 miles per hour. Since I didn't witness it myself, I just took him at his word. I had heard many different tales about the origins of skinwalkers, both from the locals and the Native Americans. There was a Native American who attended our church, still holding onto his Navajo beliefs, who told me what I always assumed to be the most accurate description. He said that when people in his tribe had a child out of incest, the tribe leaders would take the baby out into the desert to be raised by wolves. The wolves would raise the child, who would become a skinwalker with the ability to transform into anything. animals, humans, etc. The story fascinated me because he seemed so sure that this was the truth. He also warned me to never whistle at night, which I thought was strange, but I never did until one night. It was in the fall, around 11 o'clock at night. I was in my bedroom, which was the furthest room from anyone else in the house and near the garage, either watching TV or playing PlayStation. My mother was in her bedroom, and my dad was at the church, studying as he always did until around midnight. My brother had a friend over that night, and they were going to sleep on the back patio, which was a long, rectangular room with screen windows all along it. As I was in my bedroom, minding my own business, my brother and his friend came banging on my door. Annoyed, I opened it, and both my brother, who was 4 years younger than me, and his friend looked frightened. My brother said that as they were goofing off in the patio, they heard someone walking around the backyard and saw what looked like the top of a white, bald head passing by the screen windows. Now, normally I would believe my brother since he never made up stories like this, but his friend was a known liar who once claimed he had been to Mars, even showing us red dirt that looked suspiciously like the red dirt from the area. By this point, I had experienced my share of paranormal events, but I was still skeptical. Still, I grabbed my jacket and flashlight, and the three of us went out to the patio. It was always eerie at night because it was so dark, and the only light came from a nearby lamp post a few yards down the street. Our backyard was small except for the right-hand side, which was a bit bigger and had a trampoline that took up most of the space. We stepped out onto the patio, and I shone my flashlight around the yard, but we didn't see anything. That's when I heard the crunching of leaves coming from the front yard. So, the three of us went through the back gate to the front yard. Our front yard was huge, with about 9 apple trees, and there was even a large, creepy tree in the corner near the street that I always avoided for some reason. We had a close neighbor on the other side of the wooden fence. They were a nice family with a daughter my brother's age, and they had a bunch of chickens that sometimes wandered into our yard. That's what I initially thought was moving around in the front yard. I shone my flashlight around, but I didn't see any chickens. Instead, I saw something white dart behind a tree near the fence, and my curiosity spiked. We walked slowly toward the tree, and I kept my brother and his friend behind me, acting as the protective older sibling. Suddenly, I heard a loud whoosh and felt a gust of wind as something flew past us. My brother screamed in pain. He always had his shirt off, which used to annoy me because I was overweight and self-conscious. But then I noticed 3 long scratches across his chest. Scared and shocked, my brother ran back inside the house, leaving me and his friend. It all happened so fast. I ran toward the street, convinced whatever it was had gone that way, with his friend close behind me. When we reached the end of the property, I heard the sound of bare feet running down the paved road. I shone my flashlight in the direction of the sound but saw nothing. So I whistled a tune, and from down the road, the same tune was whistled back. Intrigued, I whistled again, a different tune, and once again, the same tune was echoed back to me. My brother's friend started to panic and begged me to go back inside, but I was too curious. I whistled a 3rd time, and that's when we heard a male voice, very close by, say, "Hey kid, come here." Without a second thought, we both bolted back into the house. We ran to tell my mother what had happened, and she was already alarmed, tending to my brother's scratches. We explained everything, and my mother told us to stay inside. She'd had some frightening paranormal experiences herself, which I'll need to share someday, so she believed us. I've never forgotten that encounter. My brother brushes it off nowadays, acting like it wasn't a big deal, but I know differently. So does my mother. It's one of the many incidents in my life that still bothers me to this day. Back in college, a friend and I were hanging out in our dorm room, just relaxing and chatting. We started talking about creepy stories, and I mentioned I'd heard some unsettling tales about skinwalkers. Suddenly, my friend got really quiet. "I saw one once," he said. "Up close. It's real." Naturally, I asked him to tell me more. He was hesitant at first, but eventually opened up. His story happened the summer before he left for college. He and his high school friends had planned one last big camping trip before everyone went their separate ways. He was from Scottsdale, Arizona, and he mentioned they drove about an hour and a half outside the city to a ranch owned by one of their friend's parents. There were about 8 people in the group, arriving in 3 separate cars. By the time they all showed up, it was getting dark. They set up their tents, built a fire, and started drinking and talking. One guy in their group, let's call him Tim, was acting a little off. My friend asked him if he was okay, and Tim just said, "I don't feel too great, just a bit under the weather." They didn't think much of it and continued making food and enjoying themselves. After a while, someone noticed Tim was gone. He had just disappeared without anyone seeing him leave, even though everyone had been sitting close to the fire. The group started calling his name, thinking he was playing a prank. But after an hour passed and Tim still hadn't shown up, they began to worry. My friend and a few others went out to look for him in the surrounding hills. They walked for about 15 minutes, calling his name, when they finally heard a sound. It wasn't Tim. Instead, they heard the familiar howl of a coyote, quickly followed by a few more. My friend said he started to worry that maybe Tim had been hurt or attacked by something. Everyone was on edge, especially since it didn't make sense for Tim to have left without anyone noticing. Then they heard another howl. It was different this time, longer and strange, almost like a recording of a coyote, but slightly off. My friend's heart raced when the howl ended in a kind of raspy laughter. And this time it sounded close. Uncomfortably close, like it was only 20 feet away. They began frantically looking around, still thinking Tim was somehow messing with them. But they didn't see anyone. Shaken, they returned to the campfire. By now, everyone was really concerned. They started talking about calling the authorities when suddenly, a truck pulled up to the campsite. It was Tim's truck. He got out, looking confused as to why everyone seemed so panicked. He apologized for being late, explaining that he had gotten off work a couple of hours later than expected and drove to the ranch as quickly as possible. That's when the group realized something chilling. Tim hadn't come with anyone. He hadn't been there earlier at all. Almost as if on cue, they heard another long, eerie howl, just like the one from before. At that point, they decided to leave immediately. They ended up staying at a nearby campground for the rest of the night, and nothing unusual happened after that. But my friend says he still thinks about it. He remembers asking Tim if he was feeling all right earlier that evening and how he could tell something was off. Now, he's convinced that whatever it wasn't Tim. It was something else. Something that had taken on his friend's appearance for reasons he can't explain. How it knew what Tim looked and sounded like, he doesn't know. Maybe it had somehow gotten inside their heads. About 25 years ago, my sister and I were driving on a normally busy road, but it was late at night and was deserted. We could both see something flapping on the road up ahead. I asked her what it was, and my sister said she didn't know, but that it looked like a black garbage bag. I agreed. It really looked like a bag lying on the road being whipped lightly by the wind. As we approached, it completely changed shape. It went from being quite flat and small to morphing into a fully grown man on a bike. He was just standing there in the middle of the road with his bike. We pulled alongside and asked if he was okay. He nodded but didn't speak. We drove off. We still talk about it because it was the strangest, creepiest thing ever, and we both still can't explain what we saw. My scariest night drive happened when I was 19. I was driving home from my then boyfriend's house, and I stopped at a red light on the very edge of town. It's quite remote. There were city lights behind me, but just cornfields and shelter belts ahead of me. Because it was like 2 in the morning, I was the only one sitting at the red light. I saw something moving in my peripheral vision, and because of my location, I thought it was going to be a deer. I turned my head and locked eyes with a man, maybe in his 50s. He was creeping towards my car. When he saw that I saw him, he froze, and it was then that I noticed he had a tire iron. I ran the red light and sped out of there. When I was 16, I had a junky convertible 1989 Capri. I loved that car. One night, I was driving the backroads home out in the middle of nowhere, Missouri. Top down, I was enjoying the night air. I dove under some low-hanging trees and heard a weird slap noise from the back seat. I turned around and to my horror, I saw a huge black snake frantically slithering towards the safety of under my seat. I nearly wrecked. I hate snakes and I totally panicked, even though this rat snake was 100% harmless. I pulled over screaming and called my dad to come de-snake my car. I never rode with the top down in the country again. My brother and I were driving down a super remote road late at night many years ago. Wildlife was common in the area, so we drove slower than was posted. An accident could be fatal on this road. Anyway, it was a particularly dark night, so we had the high beams on and were really concentrating on the journey. We saw it at the same time. It was impossible to miss. My brother hit the brakes and we skidded to a stop in front of the biggest cow on earth. No kidding. We could have driven under it with room to spare. It was massive and it stared at us without seeming to see us. The vibe was so creepy. Other cows were around, but they were regular in size. This guy was the king of all bovine. It doesn't seem all that weird when telling the story, but something was just off with this creature. It didn't seem quite natural. My mom was in the car with my sister who was driving, and they were on their way back from some event. The street lights on this particular stretch of road weren't working very well, and it was difficult to see. My sister is chatting away and my mom is watching the road when all of a sudden, she sees in front of the car a bike rack. It was complete with bikes on it, and it looked as if it had just dropped off the back of someone's car and they didn't notice. She screams at the top of her lungs, "Bikes!" My sister swerves, overcorrects, spins, and then comes to a stop on the other side of the road facing the opposite direction. They miraculously avoided all the cars that were going by. A few cars stopped to make sure they're okay. My sister looks at my mom and asks her how she even saw the bikes, because she didn't see them until they were almost about to hit them. My mom said she saw them and it looked like they were illuminated by a gentle blue light, but they looked back and those bikes were just sitting in the darkness. This was probably 15 years ago. My best friend in high school and I were out late being dumb teenagers. It's like 1 a.m. and we are taking the normal shortcut road back towards her house. Suddenly, I see in the ditch to my right something lumped and white. It takes about a second for me to realize it looked just like a body lying face down. I say to her, "Did you see that in the ditch? Was that a body?" She says, "I was about to ask you the same thing. What the hell?" She turns around at the stop sign up ahead and goes back. We can't quite tell from the opposite side of the road if the body was still there. So down we go and turn around again. This time we are just crawling along searching the ditch. Somehow we both glance up into the trees on a small hill above the ditch and we see it. A person in a white shirt and dark pants was crouched next to a tree trunk staring at us. We scream bloody murder and she tears ass out of there. We speed so hardcore back to her house. I don't know how we didn't die. When I was about 19, I was driving on a 2-lane road after work around 11 p.m. There were no other cars on the road and suddenly, this guy in a red shirt on a bicycle swerved from the side of the road right in front of my car. I hit him. I felt the impact. I was yelling "oh my God" over and over, and I got out of the car to see how badly he was hurt. However, I didn't see him. Couldn't find the guy. There was no bike, no red shirt guy, no dent or blood on my car. I searched the ditch with a flashlight. A couple of people passed by while I was looking in the field for a body when a sheriff's car pulled up. I told him what happened. The sheriff said I didn't hit anyone. He told me that about 15 years earlier, a young man in a red shirt was hit by a car while riding his bike right there. He died instantly. Deputy told me that every couple years, someone driving through there believes they've hit a red shirt bike rider. I was a truck driver in the late 1990s to the early 2000s. One time, I was driving through Pennsylvania on my way back to New Jersey. I pulled over to the side of the road behind two other trailers for a break. In the early morning, I'm startled to hear someone bang on my right door. I jumped from the sleeping compartment and quickly grabbed my bat. As I look out the window, I saw no one and nothing there. But now there's a loud bang on the left side. I'm starting to freak out. I look out the left window and there's nothing but silence now. I'm trying to figure out what the hell is going on, but just a few seconds later, there's banging on both doors simultaneously. The banging is so loud and heavy that my truck is shaking. I can see that there's no one out there with both curtains open. I then quickly jump in the driver's seat and start my truck. I also see the two other trucks ahead of me do the same. I don't know what happened, but it's as if they all had experienced the same thing.